It is just after 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm so glad that you could join me today for Donkey Nutrition 101. We're going to go over some of the basics of feeding donkeys, and we'll be available to answer your questions at the end of it. So let's get started. First off, welcome. My name is Christina Reynolds, and I work for Triple Crown Nutrition. I'm also an avid donkey fan, and I'm lucky enough to have a mammoth donkey in my life named Chewy, and he's going to make some appearances throughout the presentation. I have a degree from NC State University in animal science and am a certified professional animal scientist through the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists and a member of the Equine Science Society. My passion is equine nutrition and making equines' lives better through nutrition and management. A lot of what I do is working with animal owners and helping them feed their animals, whether it is just a companion who is cherished and folks want the very best for them, or they're a high performance animal, or anything in between. I love my job, and I'm always happy to connect with equine owners of all kinds and help them with their nutrition questions. So we're going to start at the very basic. So a quick review. Donkeys are equines, which is the same family and genus as horses and zebras. But there are some key differences between horses and zebras and donkeys. Donkeys in particular are very efficient at digesting things. They evolved eating poor quality scrub plants in the desert. They didn't really evolve in a situation where they were eating, nice grass pastures. They are extra sensitive to some of the metabolic disorders, things like insulin resistance, hyperlipidemia. They metabolize drugs differently than horses. They tend to be really stoic, which means they hide when they are in pain or discomfort. Horses are stoic too as prey animals because they know that if they look like the weak one who's suffering, they're going to be the quickest to be picked off by a predator. Donkeys kind of take it to a whole nother level. And a lot of times people don't realize that a donkey's not doing well until they're in a really critical state. Okay, and then also, since we're starting with the basics, let's talk about horses, donkeys, and mules. So there's a horse on the left. That's one of mine, German riding pony as a long yearling. And in the middle there is Chewy as our donkey ambassador for today. And he's a mammoth donkey. He just turned 17. His birthday was yesterday. And then on the right, there's my old mule Skeeter. And of course, a mule is a cross between a donkey and a horse. So it's a male donkey and a female horse gives you a mule. A donkey is a donkey. You get donkeys by breeding two donkeys together, and a horse is a horse, and you get horses by breeding two horses together. And then, of course, we have hinnies, which are kind of in the same category as a donkey, only that is a female donkey with a male horse. And sometimes they look different to mules, and sometimes they look very similar. But for today's presentation, we're going to be talking about donkeys specifically. All right, so when we're talking about the feeding basics, the base of the diet is always the forage. So we're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about forage. We're going to talk about how to choose a forage, and then we're going to talk about how to fill in the forage gaps. All right, so forages are fibrous plants like grass or hay, and hay is just preserved grass, and also browse, which is not something we talk about a lot in horse nutrition. And so in the forage category, there's also the forage replacers. So these are going to be things like hay pellets, hay cubes, chopped bagged forages, beet pulps, soy hulls, complete feeds. All of this is going to count towards your donkey's daily forage intake. So grass, can donkeys have grass? It depends. And this is a topic that comes up on Facebook all the time where people will be like, what should I feed my donkey? And someone comments on there, oh my gosh, that's terrible. You can't have your donkey out on a pasture. Grass is bad for donkeys. And sometimes that is true for sure. But one of the things with equine nutrition in general, whether you're talking about donkeys or horses, is you really have to tailor your approach to the animal in front of you. There are definitely a great many donkeys who should not be out on big grass pasture. But then there are also a great many donkeys who can be out on grass pasture and they do well. So it depends. We're going to discuss this a little further. It depends both on the donkey and it depends on the grass that you have. So, for the donkey who you're wondering about, is it a metabolically healthy animal? Is it one who has a history of insulin resistance and laminitis and founder? In which case, pasture grass is probably not going to be suitable for that donkey. If you're talking about a metabolically healthy animal who doesn't have issues with like insulin resistance, they don't have a history of founder and laminitis, and for all intents and purposes, they have been healthy on grass, then that might be a perfectly reasonable thing for that animal. And then we want to think about, is that animal at ideal body conditions? So one who is morbidly obese when they are on pasture, that's probably not a good situation for that donkey. If you have one who's at a good weight when they're on pasture, that might be a reasonable situation for that donkey. And then if you have a donkey who doesn't maintain their body condition score when they're on a dry lot, being on pasture may be a good option for that animal. And then when we think about the grass itself, you can have a very lush pasture, which might not be appropriate for donkeys. You could have a pasture that is very acceptable for donkeys. And it just depends on what you have. We have, at our house, we have not a huge amount of grass and not a huge pasture. We have it set up in like the Paradise track system, which works great for my mammoth donkey. It's big enough that there is grass and he's metabolically healthy, so grass is appropriate for him. He stays at a good body condition with a combination of the grass that's available to him and then the hay that I provide to make up the rest of the forage portion of his diet. And we take care of the grass there so that it never becomes lush, but it also never becomes overly stressed because stressed grass is high in sugar and can actually be more dangerous for a metabolically compromised animal than just a regular old grass pasture. And then the composition of the pasture itself is an important consideration because there's pastures where, it's a monoculture, meaning there's just one type of grass growing. Um, where we live, it's fescue grass on kind of one side of the county, and the other side of the county is Bermuda grass because it's a sand versus Piedmont situation. And in those pastures where the pastures have been like carefully maintained so that there is just grass, there's no weeds, there's nothing else growing there. That may not actually be the best situation for a donkey. They might do better in a situation where the pasture is maintained so it isn't stressed, so it's not making those super sugary grasses. But maybe there's a mix of different types of grass in the pasture, and there's some woody browse in the pasture, and some weeds that are safe for equines to eat. So those are all considerations when we're talking about pastures and grass for the donkeys. And then when we talk about hay, which again is our preserved grass, the important things to think about here are the type, the amount, and the access. Okay, we're going to stay on that screen to talk about all of those. All right, so as far as the type of hay, there's going to be all different kinds of hay that are available to you depending on where in the country and also which country you're in. And some of those are going to be appropriate for donkeys, and some of them are not going to be appropriate for donkeys. In my area, I'm in central North Carolina. Pretty lucky because we produce hay in this part of the world. We produce a nice fescue up in some parts of the state, and some places do like a fescue orchard, and then some places do Bermuda. And so those are readily available because they're grown locally. But also, we have a lot of people who ship in hay from out of state. So we get hay from like New York and New England and Canada and from out west. And we have all these different choices. And whenever you're deciding on what type of hay to feed your equine in general or donkey specifically, There's a couple things I want you to think about. One, you need something that's readily available because you don't want to run out of it. So you don't want to pick a hay that relies on, somebody bringing, small amounts from some far, far away place, and maybe they keep it in stock, maybe they don't keep it in stock. And you don't want to be changing hay constantly because the supplier doesn't keep that specific type in stock. Um, so finding something that is readily available kind of whenever you need it. For some folks, that looks like them buying a year's worth of hay all at once. But for a lot of people, that might look like buying a month or 3 months or even a week's worth of hay at a time, depending on how much storage they have. Um, it's also a consideration in this part of the world that it's generally difficult to store hay all summer because it is just so humid, and the chance of that hay spoiling increases if you don't have a really good storage situation. So you want something that's readily available. It's got to be, available in that it's at the feed store or at the farmer's. You need to be able to get it and store it appropriately. It needs to be something that you can afford because that's an important consideration. There's no point choosing a forage that you can't afford to feed the correct amount to your donkey. And then you also want to think about, okay, so out of the hay that is available for you to buy, which of those is appropriate for your donkey specifically? And generally, when we're thinking about hay for donkeys, we're thinking we want a kind of mature, what would be called a low quality hay, meaning it is more fibrous, it's less digestible, it has lower protein and lower calories. But we don't want a low quality hay in the terms of like that it's moldy or it's got a lot of contaminants in it, because equines in general, horses, donkeys, mules, they are quite susceptible to mycotoxins, which are the toxins produced by mold. And so if you're looking at hay that has mold, even if you can not see the mold, but if there was mold there previously, those toxins may be present and they can cause some issues in the gut, kind of ranging from mild to very serious. So even though we want a quote low quality hay, we want it in terms of nutrition low quality, not low quality in terms of contaminants like mold. And depending on where you are, that's going to be different types of hay. Sometimes, there's a local hay that's suitable, and other times you might have to look outside of what's locally available into something that somebody has brought in and has for sale. Um, Things that are kind of generally thought of as safe, something like a first cutting hay, something that is a harder hay. So if you're thinking about like Timothy versus orchard grass, Timothy is probably a better pick because it has more fiber. It's going to be chewed slower, digested slower. There's going to be less nutrients pulled out of it versus a soft orchard grass where they can physically eat more pounds kind of like per hour, but then also their body can digest it more efficiently. And there's some stereotypes that go with hay, things like first cutting versus second or third or fourth cutting, and even between the different species of grass used for hay. And we can kind of use those stereotypes. We just need to understand that they're not always true. So you can't just be like, oh, like this is a metabolically compromised donkey, and I heard that teff hay is a safe hay, and so I'm just going to go to the store and get some teff hay, and guaranteed it'll be the right hay for my animal. Because for every assumption that something is a certain way, there's always an example to prove it wrong. So when you're dealing with metabolically compromised animals, you do have to be more careful and more selective with what you're buying and need a little more information. Whereas if you have an animal who's metabolically healthy, there's a little more leeway there, and it's not quite as critical to have all that information presented to you. And then the amount of hay that's being fed is also an important consideration. There are probably some donkeys who can eat free choice forage, and they're going to maintain an ideal body condition score, and it's going to be fine. And then there's a population of donkeys that just isn't going to work for them, and they need a little more structure to their hay feeding. So that might look like weighing out the hay and making sure you're not feeding too much. It might look like putting it in like slow feed hay nets or slow feed containers so that they can't eat it all and be done with it in a couple hours and then be standing around waiting for the next hay meal. Um, so it just depends on the donkey as to how much they need. And of course, there's considerations on the type of donkey too. If you think about a mini donkey weighing 250 to 300 pounds, that donkey is going to have much different needs than a mammoth donkey who's 15.2 and weighs, 800 to 900 pounds. And then the access part there, that comes into this with the amount, how easy is it for the donkey to get that? How often are they getting it? Donkeys are trickle feeders, kind of like horses, in that they need to be eating kind of roughly all the time. Um, so the access to it becomes important because if they're just being fed a hay meal once a day and they can finish it in a couple hours and then there's nothing for them to eat for the majority of the day, that can be really hard on their digestive system and can lead to some other issues like colic or ulcers. Um, but again, some animals can't have 24/7 access to the forage. So finding what works for your donkey specifically and then coming up with a plan so that they have access to it throughout the day. Okay, so talked about hay. This is the other part of the forage category, and this is the forage replacers. So this is things like hay cubes, hay pellets, chopped forages. Um, in horses, we think about forage replacers as a way to improve the forage quality of the diet. So say you have a horse and the hay that's available to you is a lower quality hay and the horse needs more calories or more protein or both from their hay diet. And we can replace part of the diet or all of the diet with some of these forage replacers like hay cubes, hay pellets, or chopped forage. In donkeys, we're rarely trying to improve the forage itself. We're usually trying to decrease the forage quality. So for donkeys, we're not thinking about, oh, let's add, alfalfa cubes into the diet. We're thinking about let's put a more bland, more controlled forage in with the forage that they're getting from either their grass or their hay to decrease the overall average of the forage. And so products here like the Timothy Balance cubes or the Safe Starch Forage, those are places where we can bring those in and they are a known um, entity. Like we know how much sugar and starch they have, we know how many calories, and we know that they are safe for the donkeys. And so for some donkeys, it may be appropriate to feed the total diet of that, like somebody who's in a current laminitic crisis um, or has a history that you're trying to overcome. And then for other ones, we can replace part of the forage in the diet. Something like we could take a quarter of the hay out and put in that amount in pounds in the Timothy Balance cubes, for example, or maybe even like half and half. And then for animals who have dentition issues, so this is talking about the issues with their teeth. And that could be anything from the animal is just old and their teeth are really worn and they don't have a grinding surface anymore. And it may be appropriate to provide some or all of their diet in hay pellets. Or it might be one who has malformations of the mouth, like you get in some of the miniatures that have the dwarfism, where their mouth doesn't work quite like it's supposed to, and we need to give them a little bit of help in chewing their forage so that they can digest it properly downstream from the mouth. Or it could be one who's had an injury. Animals can get cavities and cracked teeth. They can get diastema, which are gaps between the teeth that can get packed with long stem forage, which then causes periodontal disease and causes a lot of pain in the mouth and makes them not want to chew, regular long stemmed hay. So those are all places where these forage replacers come into play. Aside from the pellets cubed chopped forages, we also have this category. So beet pulp and soy hulls are commonly called super fibers because they're so easily digestible by the animal's gut bugs, which are what do all of the fiber digesting. And then complete feeds also count in the forage replacer category. So beet pulp is very readily available. Most people have heard of it. Almost every single feed store sells beet pulp. It's very easily digestible by the animal because it's very easily digestible by their gut bugs. And like I said, we call it a super fiber because it works so well for them. It's low sugar, it's low starch, which is good. You can get beet pulp with molasses and it has a little higher sugar. So in general, for donkeys, I recommend just getting the non-molasses version. But even the molasses version, it has very little molasses added to it. And it's around 1,000 calories per pound dry weight. And it comes in shreds, pellets, flakes, all different ways that you can buy it. And when you're weighing it, or feeding it, weighing it is helpful because when you're feeding the shreds, it actually takes quite a lot of the shreds to make up even just like 1 pound. And then by the time you add water to it, it makes this really big volume. And so sometimes people think they're feeding a lot more of it than they actually are. And weighing it is really helpful when you're not just feeding a little bit as like a digestive conditioning type thing, and you're relying on it for part of the actual forage portion of the diet. It's really helpful to weigh it dry so you know how much you're feeding. The pellets are easier to scoop. They're more dense, per quart, they weigh more. And so that may be useful for some people when they're trying to keep things consistent day to day, or if different people are feeding. And then there's flakes like Speedy Beet, which is quite an expensive product, but it soaks super fast. Um, and it's a known low sugar, low starch feed. It's non-GMO for people who are concerned about that. So those are all products that are available in the beet pulp category. Most animals like it. It's pretty palatable. Some don't, but by and large, it's known as like a tasty thing for them to eat. The next category are soy hulls, and this is the hull is the kind of like the casing of the soy beans or seeds, and it's something it's readily available in that it's used in a lot of feed. A lot of people feed it to cattle, but it's not as commonly available just as a bagged, 50-pound bag that you can get at pretty much any feed store. In some areas of the country, it's more available than others. It is also an easily digestible super fiber. It's low in sugar and starch. It might be lower palatability, but that was really talking about with horses, and I feel like most donkeys find it tasty. And it comes in hard pellets that generally you're going to need to soak. And then when you think about complete feeds, these are feeds that have a certain percent of fiber in them and are designed that they could be fed as the total diet to an equine. And of course, the formulation is done for horses. Now they're readily available. Pretty much every feed company has one, if not, 3 or 4 complete feeds in their lineup. Pretty much every feed store is going to carry anywhere from 1 to 15 different complete feeds. Most senior feeds are a complete feed, and then there's certainly other ones as well. They're usually a forage-based feed, and they're generally easily digestible because they're designed for seniors who need that easy digestibility. And the base of them is going to be forage. So it's usually a combination of like beet pulp, alfalfa meal, soy hulls, sometimes less digestible fibers like peanut hulls in the lower quality products. And they can be quite low in sugar and starch, but it's going to vary by product and by company. So this is somewhere where it's good to either speak to a feed sales rep or speak to a nutritionist or perhaps to your extension agent, and they can kind of help you navigate what's available in your area and whether they would be suitable. Um, so that's something that you do want to double check versus just going and being like, oh, the lady on the internet told me that senior feed is suitable for my donkey, because some of them certainly are, and then others are not. Complete feeds tend to be very palatable. They're tasty because they've got all that other stuff in them. It could be too many calories for a lot of donkeys. There's probably not a great many donkeys that really are going to eat a full serving of complete feed. And of course, there's exceptions to that, which we'll talk about. And then, like I said, there's a huge variety of these. So pretty much there's something for everyone. It's just a matter of picking through the 30 different options that your feed store may have and finding out what would be right for your donkey specifically. All right, and then this is a category that we don't talk about really in horse nutrition, but browse are woody plants, shrubs, leaves, twigs, kind of everything except grass. And as you may know, donkeys like that. And in general, they're going to voluntarily consume more of that than most horses do. That's not to say some horses don't love to go nibbling along the hedgerow, but donkeys, they do like to eat these more woody plants. And there's some interest in why they can do that, and it's probably because they're better at digesting them due to the way they evolved and the environment they were in. They might have different microbes in their gut that help them digest these woodier, harder to digest plants. The nice thing about browse is it does provide some enrichment as well as nutrition. It's something for them to do. It's going to make them walk around more because they're looking for, tasty little nibbles. And there's some possibilities that there's some added benefits to providing browse in the equine diets. This isn't really hugely substantiated by like science, but a lot of people online are talking about even with their horses, the benefits of them going out and trying different plants and kind of eating different things. Okay, and then when we're talking about forage, the next question is we kind of talked about what kind. Now we're going to talk about how much. And in general, for equines, 1.25% of their ideal body weight daily is the absolute minimum that they should get in forage. And so if you think about 1,000 pound, say, we'll just, for the sake of easy math, we'll do 1,000 pound horse. So this is like a kind of smaller body quarter horse. They're going to need 12.5 pounds of forage daily at absolute minimum. And then you can do that math, obviously, for any animal. So if you have a standard donkey versus a mini versus a mammoth, you can do 0.0125 times whatever their actual weight is, and that'll give you the minimum. And so this comes in, what is your donkey's ideal body weight? Best case scenario, you've actually weighed your donkey on a scale and you know how much they weigh, and then maybe your vet or yourself know what they should be at. Maybe they're a little heavy or a little light. Um, but many people don't have access to a scale, and so there's some calculations online, some formulas that'll help you get a reasonably good estimate. And there are weigh tapes that you can use. They're calculated more for horses, so sometimes they're not perfectly accurate, but it does get you in a good ballpark. Um, when you're trying to figure that out. And then, so if 1.25% of ideal body weight daily is the absolute minimum, most of them are going to fall in this range of 1.5 to 2.5%, with most of them needing 1.5 to 2%. There's some exceptions where they might need that higher number, but not always. So again, if we're talking about your 1,000 pound animal, that's 15 to 20 pounds per day. And that needs to be weighed dry because water doesn't count towards that. And when it comes to pasture, there's some helpful information on estimating how much intake they can get on pasture. It's based on how dense the grass plants are in the pasture and how tall the grass is and how many hours that your animal is out on it. And a lot of that research was done by my advisor, Dr. Siciliano at NC State. So shout out to NC State for their pasture grass research over there because it's really helpful information when we're trying to put together these diets. Okay, and then so we've talked about what kind of forage, how much of it, and then we're going to talk about filling in the gaps because all forages are missing key nutrients, things like copper, zinc, iodine, magnesium, just in general, all forages are going to be missing some of that. And the way you can fill in those gaps is with what you're feeding the horse, whether you call it feed or grain. We're going to talk about ration balancers, forage balancers, feed, and minerals specifically, because these are the most common ways to accomplish this. So ration balancers are a concentrated way of feeding nutrients without a lot of calories, protein, carbs, which is your starch and sugars and stuff like that. So basically, what they do is they take everything that an equine needs in a day that is likely missing from the forage, and they put it in with just a little bit of stuff that's going to make it tasty enough for them actually to eat it, but not contribute a lot of calories and carbs to it. These usually have a low feeding rate of 1 pound per 1,000 pounds of ideal body weight. Um, there are some who have a higher feeding rate, so this is where you want to look at the tag on your bag specifically and make sure that you're feeding to that recommendation. So for the Triple Crown ones, it's 1 pound per 1,000 pounds of body weight. And 1 pound is 3 kitchen measuring cups. So for a 1,000 pound animal, they might need 1 pound. And then for something like a mini donkey, they probably need around a third of a pound, which is 1 kitchen measuring cup, and that's per day. And then maybe you have a standard who's right smack in the middle and he weighs 500 pounds. And so he would need a half a pound per day. In general, these are pretty palatable products because they have like a bit of wheat midds or something like that that's going to bind the pellet together and kind of mask a little bit of the mineral taste. Minerals don't taste good by themselves. Ration balancers anymore are very easily accessible. Almost every brand has at least one. Some of them have more than one. I think every feed store that I've been in the last 5 years has had between 1 and 5 to choose from. So they're readily available, generally palatable. They're going to provide what you need. And this is just a really great way of feeding long ears in general, easy keepers, in general. This is a great way of doing it. And these bags are 50-pound bags. So you think about if you're feeding, even for a big, for a mammoth, say you're feeding 1 pound per day, that bag is going to last you 5 weeks. It's going to cost you just over 60 cents a day to feed it, which is 20 bucks a month. And if you're talking about a mini, for example, you're going to be spending 20 cents a day. That's it, to get them everything that they need. Plus, in this case, like a robust hindgut support package and all the other niceties that come with it. So it's a very cost-effective way of feeding equines, and generally it's really appropriate way of feeding donkeys. The other category is forage balancers, and these are even more concentrated again than the ration balancers, and they have a feeding rate of usually somewhere between 4 to 8 ounces per day. So that's like between a quarter and a half a pound versus a ration balancer, which is a pound. Um, and again, when we're talking about these, they're listed by this one in 1,000 pounds of ideal body weight. So a good size standard might, or a good size mammoth might get 8 ounces. A standard might get 4 ounces per day, and that's a very small amount. So it's very concentrated. This is going to get you into this area where it's kind of mixed as far as palatability. Some of them are definitely more palatable than others. I've got a picture of the Triple Crown Diamond Balancer on there. That's a relatively new product that's available at Tractor Supply, and it's a mini pellet, and it does seem to have just enough of the tasty stuff that I haven't had any creatures who didn't like it. The donkeys have accepted it really well. Um, and then there's other ones which maybe have like a more minerally taste and the animals may not like as much. For those, you can try starting with a very, very small amount. And some of those brands even tell you to start that way. It may look like feeding a quarter of the recommended amount to start with and then gradually increasing. One of the things I see with that is they're quite popular on some corners of the internet, and people are kind of like, that's what animals need. They don't need any extra stuff. They just need a forage balancer in their forage. The problem with that is some animals don't like it, and you can make the nicest ration in the world on paper, but if the animal won't actually eat it, then they're not getting the nutrition they need. So then I'll see people be like, oh, well, just feed it with some hay pellets or with some beet pulp or with some flax or with some feed. And sometimes that just makes life very complicated. And then other times, by the time they've added in all the things that make the animal want to actually eat the product, they probably could have just fed either a balancer or a more palatable one and still gotten the nutrition, but not had to kind of jump through all those hoops. And certainly if you're somebody who's like, that's fine, I love feeding some beet pulp, some hay pellets, some flax, and something to make it more tasty, that's totally fine. But if you're somebody who's going to be like, oh, my animal doesn't like this balancer, so I'm not going to feed anything, then I would rather that they fed a ration balancer or a more palatable forage balancer. All right, and then there's feed or grain, as some people call it. So this is going to provide what's missing from the forage. And then in addition, plus it's going to provide calories, protein, maybe some sugar and starch, depending on the product. This is useful for animals who need to gain condition, who might be, a little skinnier than we want, or who are in work, or ones who are burning more calories, maybe a lactating mama who's in peak lactation. And these are usually designed to be fed something like a minimum of 5 pounds per day per 1,000 pounds of body weight. So when we're talking about, smaller animals, obviously that goes down based on their body weight. There's not a whole lot of donkeys that need to get 5 pounds of feed per day, but there are certainly some. And I have Chewy in these pictures again, and he's a pretty active guy, depending on what season of the year it is. And sometimes he does actually eat 5 pounds of senior a day, and then other times he doesn't eat that much. But I would say he's fairly unique in that. He's a fairly big bodied donkey. He's about 15'2". And if he's out and we're trail riding and showing and driving and doing all the things, then he's actually burning through some calories. And he's a metabolically healthy animal. He doesn't have any issues, knock on wood, with metabolic dysfunction or anything like that. Okay. And then minerals, which can be fed loose or you can feed them, set amount per day. It's usually around 2 ounces per day. When they're fed free choice, it can be hard to get the correct intake. Like I said earlier, minerals are not particularly tasty, but the companies will add stuff to make them more tasty to encourage their intake. And one of the ways that mineral intake is usually controlled is by how much salt is in it. So, salt is the only mineral that equines search out and will actually consume to the correct amount on their own. And the companies know, how much salt horses in general are going to want to voluntarily take in, and then they use the right amount in the mix of the minerals to make sure that they get, the 2 ounces or 3 ounces, whatever amount it's supposed to be fed at. Um, but that's all working on averages, and not every individual read the textbook. So some animals are going to want to take in more salt, and so they're going to take in more of all the other minerals also. And then some animals are going to want to take in less salt, sodium, and then they're not going to take in enough of the other minerals. And some animals get into these like kind of just behavioral things where they want to eat lots and lots of it, and they just sit there and either lick or chew the blocks or the loose stuff and get way too much of it. So loose minerals or pressed minerals, when they're fed free choice, it's not my favorite way of feeding equines, but I do understand in some cases it's the only option, in which case you just try and make things work as best as they can. If you notice that you've got, say you've got a pressed mineral block out in the field that's designed for equines, not for cattle, we should actually take a moment just to talk about that, because donkeys should not be eating cattle minerals, or other livestock minerals. Donkeys, like horses, are very sensitive to the rumensin, monensin, all of those that can be in cattle minerals. And even if the mineral that you feed doesn't contain those ionophores, if it's processed in a plant that does have them, there is always the chance of cross-contamination. And when a product is not labeled for equines, it's only labeled for cattle or for small ruminants, the quality control stuff changes. So they're not as concerned about that ionophore cross-contamination as they would if the mineral was labeled for horses or equines in general. So that's just something to be very mindful of, especially because in the not too long ago, I've had a couple big ionophore contaminations that have resulted in herds of horses being dead. And it's really tragic, and it is preventable, by kind of taking some safety measures along the way. And one of those is just using products that are labeled for equines. Of course, that doesn't remove the risk altogether, but it does reduce the risk quite a lot. So make sure you're getting something that is labeled for equines slash horses. And then your chance of having the ionophores present is going to be much lower. The quality of these minerals does vary dramatically. I talk to folks or I see folks online, they're talking about feeding mineral salt, and it's important to know that kind of your red salt blocks or red loose mineral is not an appropriate source of minerals for them. It's not going to provide enough of any of them. Basically, you're kind of paying for a little iron oxide that makes it look red. So if you're looking to actually supplement minerals, you need a mineral versus a mineral salt. And within those minerals, the quality does vary. You've got some that are going to provide both a high quality mineral and enough of it, and it's going to get consumed in the correct amount. And then other products, it's not going to provide enough. Okay, so in review, to kind of wrap things up, we need to choose the right forage for the animal that we're working with, whether that is grass or hay replacers. Um, we need to choose the one that is right for that animal. And then we also need to feed the right amount of that forage. So knowing what the animal weighs, doing a little math and figuring out how much we're actually feeding, looking at the animal in front of us, seeing what their body condition is like, because that's going to guide us as to how much we can feed of it. If you have an animal that you've been feeding, say 1.5% of their body weight, and they look a little lean on that, that's a sign that you should increase the amount of forage being fed. Um, and also, by that token, if you have an animal who's looking overweight or overconditioned, you'll want to decrease the amount of forage that's being fed. And then we need to fill in the gaps in the forage and make sure that we're providing, enough vitamins, minerals, protein, the essential amino acids that have to come from the diet that the animal can't make on their own. And that's going to come from those ration balancers and forage balancers, feed, minerals. And so I'd like to say thank you for taking the time to join me today. It's awesome that we have so many new donkey owners and that they care so much about their donkeys that they're seeking out information about how to take care of them better. My email address is on the bottom there. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions. Triple Crown is a great company to work with because they really care about us having lots of knowledge to pass along to the clients. And so take advantage of that. And then if you're looking for other resources on how to feed your donkeys, some vets are really good with that. Extension agents are an option, independent nutritionists. There's a lot of PhD nutritionists you can book a consult with, and they're great to work with. One who I do things with is Dr. Claire Tunis at Clarity Equine Nutrition, and she's great. She's lovely to work with, and I'm sure she'd love to hear from you. Um, but yeah, so thank you for joining me. And then we'll continue this series. We've got a couple more options coming up. We'll have one on doing donkey feet and understanding more about that, one on donkey welfare and some topics that Dr. Hamilton's going to talk about. And then we'll have a talk about drugs and donkeys because that's a pretty unique area also. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon.